October 30th, 1989. Mitsubishi Estate Company paid $1.4 billion for Rockefeller Center in Manhattan. The most iconic piece of American real estate, built during the Great Depression as a symbol of American capitalism, now belonged to Japan. The president of Mitsubishi stood in the lobby beneath the golden statue of Prometheus and smiled for photographers. Behind him, 200 American protesters held signs that read, "Remember Pearl Harbor." One man was smashing a Sony television with a baseball bat on the sidewalk. Another was burning a Japanese flag. A woman screamed into a news camera. "They are buying our country with our own money." She was right. But by the time anyone understood what she meant, it was already too late. The war was over. Japan had won, and nobody had fired a single shot. This is the story of how Japan defeated America in 15 years, and how America destroyed Japan in 48 hours. This is the story of the greatest economic war in history, and why both sides lost. We start in 1973, because that is when everything changed. The oil crisis. October 17th. Arab nations cut oil production and prices quadrupled overnight. In Detroit, Michigan, gas stations ran dry. Cars lined up for blocks. Fights broke out at pumps. The American economy, built on cheap gasoline and big cars, seized up like an engine without oil. Thomas Fletcher was 42 years old, married with 3 kids, and he had worked at the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan for 23 years. He built Chevrolet Impalas on the assembly line. Big cars, heavy cars. Cars with V8 engines that got 10 miles per gallon. Cars that suddenly nobody wanted to buy. On November 12, 1973, his supervisor called him into the office. "The plant is cutting second shift. You are laid off effective immediately. 2 weeks severance. We will call you when production picks up." Thomas drove home in his 1971 Impala, watching the fuel gauge drop, calculating how much the gas was costing him per mile. He had a mortgage. His oldest daughter was starting college next year. His wife worked part-time at a grocery store. The math did not work. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with bills spread in front of him, and his wife asked the question he had been dreading. "Can we keep the house?" He did not know. Nobody knew. The entire American auto industry was collapsing in slow motion, and 800,000 people like Thomas were watching their lives dissolve. 6,000 miles west, in Nagoya, Japan, a young engineer named Eiji Toyoda was working late at Toyota headquarters, drinking cold tea and studying production reports. Toyota had built a small, light, fuel-efficient car called the Corolla. 4 cylinders, 30 miles per gallon. Cheap to make, cheap to run, boring to drive. In 1972, Americans had ignored it. In 1973, Americans were lining up to buy it. Eiji looked at the export numbers. In October 1972, Toyota sold 37,000 cars in America. In October 1973, they sold 183,000. That was a 400% increase in 1 year. He picked up the phone and called the production manager at home, waking him up at 2 a.m. Triple the export production line. Immediately. Hire more workers. Run 3 shifts. The Americans need our cars, and we are going to give them what they need. The production manager, still half asleep, asked the obvious question. What if this is temporary? What if gas prices drop and Americans go back to big cars? Eiji Toyoda, who had spent his entire adult life rebuilding Japan from the ashes of World War II, who had watched American occupation forces treat Japanese industry like a hobby project, who had studied American manufacturing and found it wasteful and arrogant, smiled in the empty office. "It is not temporary. This is the beginning. Now go hire those workers." He was right. By 1975, Japanese cars had captured 10% of the American market. By 1980, it was 25%. By 1985, it was 35%. Toyota, Honda, Nissan. They were not just selling cars. They were humiliating Detroit. Thomas Fletcher got called back to work at GM in 1974, but the overtime was gone. The bonuses were gone. The security was gone. In 1979, the plant cut shifts again. In 1981, they closed an entire building. In 1982, they offered early retirement packages to senior workers. Thomas was 51 years old. If he took the package, he would get 60% of his pension. If he stayed, the plant might close completely, and he would get nothing. His daughter had graduated college with $18,000 in student loans. His son was working at a parts supplier that was also cutting jobs. His youngest was still in high school. His wife cried when they discussed it. 29 years you gave them. 29 years, and they are pushing you out like garbage. Thomas signed the early retirement papers on a Friday afternoon in March 1982. He cleaned out his locker, walked past the assembly line where he had spent 3 decades of his life, and drove home. On the way, he passed a Toyota dealership. The parking lot was full. Families were looking at Camrys and Corollas. Smiling salesmen in cheap suits were shaking hands and writing contracts. Thomas felt something hot and acidic rise in his throat. He pulled into the lot, got out of his car, and walked up to a salesman. "You know these cars are killing American jobs. You know that, right?" The salesman, young, maybe 25, looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I just work here. People want reliable cars. These are reliable." Thomas wanted to hit him. Instead, he walked back to his car, sat behind the wheel, and cried for the first time since his father's funeral. He was 51 years old. He had worked since he was 18, and his country had decided he was obsolete. In Tokyo, the victory felt like destiny. By 1984, Japan was producing more cars than America. Japanese companies were buying American real estate. Sony bought Columbia Pictures. Matsushita bought Universal Studios. Japanese tourists flooded Hawaii and California, spending money Americans no longer had. The value of all land in Japan exceeded the value of all land in the United States. The Imperial Palace grounds in Tokyo were worth more than the entire state of California. Noboru Takeshita, newly appointed Minister of Finance, sat in his office on the 8th floor of the Kasumigaseki building and read the economic reports with a feeling close to euphoria. Japan's GDP was growing at 6% annually. Unemployment was 2.7%. The trade surplus with America had reached $80 billion per year. $80 billion. That number was almost incomprehensible. It meant that every single year, $80 billion flowed from American pockets into Japanese bank accounts because Americans chose to buy Japanese products. His secretary knocked on the door. "Minister, the American ambassador's on the line. He says, Treasury Secretary James Baker wants to arrange a meeting. Something about international currency cooperation." Takeshita felt a small cold sensation in his chest, like swallowing ice water. What kind of meeting? He did not provide details, just that it is urgent and involves the major industrial nations. September in New York, the Plaza Hotel. Takeshita thanked his secretary and hung up the phone. He walked to the window and looked out at Tokyo. The city sprawled beneath him, a forest of glass and steel and neon. 40 years ago, this city was ash and rubble. American B-29 bombers had burned it to the ground. 100,000 people died in one night. His mother had been one of them. He had been 21 years old, visiting relatives in Osaka when the firebombing happened. He came home to find his neighborhood erased. His mother's body was never found, just ash. And now Japan owned Rockefeller Center. Now Japanese cars filled American streets. Now American workers were lining up for unemployment benefits while Japanese factories ran 3 shifts. It felt like justice. It felt earned. It felt permanent. But Takeshita had studied history. He knew that America did not accept defeat. He knew that when America lost, America changed the rules. And he knew that a meeting at the Plaza Hotel with language like international currency cooperation meant one thing. The Americans were about to demand payment for Japan's success. He picked up the phone and called his deputy minister. Start modeling scenarios. What happens to our economy if the yen strengthens by 20%, by 30%, by 50%? I want full reports by the end of the week. There was silence on the line. Minister, do you think they would demand that much? Takeshita looked out at the glittering city and thought about his mother burning to death in 1945. I think they will demand whatever they believe will break us, and we need to know if we can survive it. 3 weeks later, the report arrived on his desk. The numbers were brutal. If the yen strengthened by 30%, Japanese exports would become too expensive to compete. Toyota, Sony, Panasonic. All of them depended on a weak yen to undercut American prices. If the yen doubled in value, the entire export economy would collapse. Factories would close. Workers would lose jobs. The real estate bubble, built on the assumption of perpetual growth, would burst. Banks holding trillions in inflated property loans would fail. The cascade would destroy everything Japan had built in 40 years. Takeshita read the report twice, then locked it in his safe. He did not share it with anyone. Because if this analysis was correct, and if the Americans understood Japan's vulnerability, then the meeting in September was not a negotiation. It was a trap, and Japan had no choice but to walk into it. In Detroit, Robert Lutz stood in the empty Building 12 at the GM Technical Center and tried to imagine what 30,000 workers sounded like. This building used to employ that many people. 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Now it was silent except for his footsteps echoing on concrete. The assembly line sat motionless, covered in dust. Somebody had spray painted on the wall, Sayonara GM. His assistant walked up behind him. The union is threatening to strike if we announce more layoffs. Congress is holding hearings about Japanese trade practices, and the president is meeting with auto executives next week to discuss options. Lutz turned around. What options? We spent 20 years building bad cars and treating customers like idiots. Toyota spent 20 years building good cars and treating customers like partners. That is not a trade issue. That is a competence issue. His assistant looked uncomfortable. Secretary Baker thinks he can negotiate a currency revaluation. Make the yen stronger so Japanese cars cost more. Level the playing field. Lutz laughed, and it sounded bitter even to himself. Level the playing field. That is what we call it when we change the rules because we are losing. You know what the Japanese call that? Cheating. And they would be right. But even as he said it, Lutz knew the currency intervention was coming. Because America could not accept that Japan had simply outcompeted them. It was psychologically impossible. So they would blame currency manipulation, unfair trade practices, closed markets. Anything except the truth. The truth was too painful. America had won World War II and gotten lazy. Japan had lost World War II and gotten hungry. And hunger beat laziness every single time. On September 10, 1985, Noboru Takeshita received the formal agenda for the Plaza meeting. His hands shook as he read it. The United States proposed coordinated intervention to realign major currencies. Translation: Japan and Germany would be forced to strengthen their currencies while America weakened the dollar. It was not a request. It was a demand backed by the threat of trade war, tariffs, and isolation. Takeshita called an emergency meeting of his senior staff. They gathered in a windowless conference room at midnight. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Finally, his deputy asked the question everyone was thinking. Can we refuse? Takeshita shook his head. If we refuse, the Americans will impose tariffs on our exports. Congress is already drafting legislation. We lose access to our largest market and our economy collapses. If we agree, the yen strengthens and our exports become too expensive and our economy collapses slower. Those are our options. One of the younger economists spoke up. Perhaps our economy is strong enough to absorb the shock. Perhaps we can adapt. Takeshita looked at the young man and felt very old. You are 30 years old. You have lived your entire adult life in a Japan that only grows and prospers. You do not remember 1945. I do. I remember what it looks like when a country collapses. And I'm telling you, if we agree to what the Americans want, we will see that collapse again. It will just take longer and hurt more people. Then what do? We go to New York, we negotiate the best terms possible, we try to minimize the damage, and we pray that I am wrong about how bad this is going to be. But Noboru Takeshita was not wrong, and in 48 hours, in a closed room at the Plaza Hotel, 5 men would sign a document that would destroy Japan's economy for the next 30 years. The only question left was whether anyone would understand what had happened before it was too late to stop it. September 22, 1985, 9:47 a.m., Plaza Hotel, New York City. Noboru Takeshita held a Mont Blanc pen worth more than most Americans earned in a week, and understood with perfect clarity that when he signed the document in front of him, he would be ending Japan's economic miracle. The room smelled like leather briefcases and fear. 5 men, 1 table, 48 hours to decide who wins the economic war. James Baker, United States Secretary of Treasury, sat across from him. No pleasantries, no small talk. Baker slid a 4-page document across the mahogany table. The dollar is overvalued. Your currencies are undervalued. We need coordinated intervention. The target is 30 to 40% appreciation of the yen within 18 months. Takeshita's stomach dropped. The yen was trading at 242 to the dollar. A 40% appreciation meant 145 yen per dollar. Every Toyota Corolla selling for $7,000 in America would suddenly cost $11,000. Who buys a car that became 60% more expensive overnight? Secretary Baker, with respect, that level of revaluation would devastate Japanese industry. Baker leaned forward. Minister Takeshita, let me be direct. Congress is drafting comprehensive tariff legislation. Cars, electronics, steel, everything. The votes are there. If those tariffs pass, your exports drop 60% and your economy collapses in 6 months. This meeting is your chance to avoid that outcome. The threat sat between them like a loaded gun. Takeshita had known it was coming, but hearing it spoken made it real. How much time do we have to consider this? Baker checked his watch. We reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. You have 23 hours. Across the table, German Finance Minister Gerhard Stoltenberg cleared his throat. And if we refuse, then you deal with the consequences individually. Tariffs, import quotas, sanctions, your choice. Day 1, 11:15 a.m., Tokyo Stock Exchange. Hiroshi Yamada was 34 years old, a currency trader at Nomura Securities, and he was watching something impossible happen on his Bloomberg terminal. The dollar was falling. Not drifting, falling. Someone was selling dollars in massive volume. Someone who knew something the market did not. His phone rang. Then every phone in the trading room rang simultaneously. What the hell is happening? His supervisor screamed across the floor. Yamada's hands shook as he typed queries into the terminal. Dollar-yen dropping 2% in 30 minutes. No news, no announcement. Just massive selling pressure. Someone knows something, he said quietly. Someone very big. Day 1. 2:30 p.m., Detroit, Michigan. Thomas Fletcher sat in the Union Hall with 200 other auto workers watching the news on a television mounted in the corner. The volume was low, but he could read the ticker at the bottom. G5 finance ministers meet in New York. Currency intervention expected. A younger worker, maybe 30, turned to him. What does currency intervention mean? Thomas had been reading about this for months. It means they are going to make Japanese cars more expensive. Make it fair again, level the playing field. The young worker smiled. So, we might get our jobs back? Thomas wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that someone in Washington actually cared about Flint, Michigan. But he had been laid off 3 times in 12 years. He knew better. Maybe, he said, maybe. Day 1, 7:15 p.m. Plaza Hotel private dining room. They served filet mignon and French wine in a room with crystal chandeliers. Takeshita sat between Baker and the French finance minister. The conversation was carefully casual. Weather, baseball, New York restaurants. Nobody mentioned that they were negotiating the destruction of Japan's economy over Chateau Margaux that cost $500 per bottle. Halfway through dinner, Baker set down his fork. Minister Takeshita, I want you to understand something. This is not about punishing Japan. American manufacturing is dying. Workers who built the tanks and planes that won World War II are now unemployed. Their communities are collapsing. If my president does nothing, someone more extreme takes power, someone who imposes 50% tariffs and pulls America out of international trade entirely. What I am proposing is the moderate option. Takeshita met his eyes, and from Japan's perspective, we followed every rule America imposed on us after the war. We adopted your democracy, opened our markets, became your ally, and now that we succeeded using your capitalist system, you want to punish us for being too good at it. How is that fair? Baker's expression did not change. Fairness is not relevant. Power is relevant. And right now, America has the power to destroy your economy. I am offering you a chance to manage that destruction. That is as fair as geopolitics gets. Day 1, 11:00 p.m., Takeshita's hotel room. He called his wife. In Tokyo, it was 1 p.m. the next day. She answered on the 3rd ring. How is New York? Cold. Takeshita looked out at Manhattan's lights and thought about what he could not say. In 24 hours, I sign a document that will destroy our economy. In 2 years, our house loses half its value. In 5 years, your brother's company goes bankrupt. In 10 years, an entire generation graduates into an economy with no jobs and no hope. When do you come home? Soon. After one more meeting. After he hung up, he sat in darkness for a long time. He thought about his mother burning in the Tokyo firebombing. He thought about 40 years of rebuilding. And he thought about how economic wars created the same casualties as military wars, just slower and quieter. Day 2, 6:45 a.m., Tokyo currency markets. Yamada had not slept. The overnight trading in London and New York showed the same pattern. Massive dollar selling. The yen had strengthened from 242 to 237 in less than 24 hours with no official announcement. His supervisor stood behind him, coffee in hand, staring at the screens. What do you think it means? Yamada pulled up historical charts going back to 1945. He had never seen currency movement this violent without a war or a coup. Whatever is happening in New York, it is going to change everything. Day 2, 9 a.m., Plaza Hotel Conference Room. They reconvened, no breakfast, no coffee, just 5 men and 1 document. Baker went around the table asking each minister for final positions. The British agreed, the French agreed, the Germans negotiated minor language changes, then agreed. Baker turned to Takeshita. Minister? Takeshita looked at the document. He thought about Thomas Fletcher in Detroit losing his pension. He thought about Japanese factory workers who would soon face the same fate. He thought about how victory and defeat looked the same when the shooting stopped. What assurances can you provide that this will not lead to further demands? That 40% is the maximum? Baker's face was unreadable. The market will determine the final exchange rate. We are simply agreeing to coordinate intervention. There are no guarantees, which meant there were no limits either. If the yen kept strengthening past 40%, America would just watch it happen. I need 10 minutes. Takeshita and his deputy stepped into the hallway. The younger man was pale. If we sign this, we commit economic suicide. If we refuse, America destroys us with tariffs. We have no good options. Takeshita straightened his tie. Then we choose the option that preserves the alliance. At least, if we maintain American friendship, we can rebuild. If we defy them, we are isolated and destroyed anyway. They returned to the conference room. Takeshita picked up the Mont Blanc pen. His hand was steady. He signed his name in careful Japanese characters. September 23, 1985. 10:12 a.m. 4 other signatures followed. Baker stood and shook everyone's hand. Gentlemen, we have just stabilized the global economy. History will remember this as a landmark achievement. Takeshita said nothing, because he knew history would remember this as the day America broke Japan. Day 3, Monday morning, global markets. The Plaza Accord was announced publicly. Within 4 hours, the dollar fell 4%. Within 1 month, it fell 12%. The yen surged from 242 to 220, then 200, then 180. In Detroit, Thomas Fletcher watched the news and allowed himself to hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe American factories would come back. In Tokyo, Hiroshi Yamada watched his screens and felt cold fear. The yen was not stopping. 180, 170, 160. Japanese export companies were bleeding. Their stock prices collapsed. The whole structure was coming apart. In a plane over the Pacific, Noboru Takeshita looked out at the ocean and thought about his mother burning in 1945. At least this time, nobody dies immediately, he thought. The dying would take years, slow, quiet, invisible. And maybe that was worse. Within 2 years, the yen would hit 150. Within 5 years, 120. Japanese real estate prices would collapse. Banks would fail. A recession would begin that would last 30 years. They would call them the lost decades. And every Japanese economist would trace the beginning back to September 23, 1985. The day 5 men signed a document at the Plaza Hotel and changed the world. March 15, 2011, Tokyo Metropolitan Hospital. 4:37 a.m., Noboru Takeshita lay dying in a hospital bed, morphine dripping into his veins, and he could not stop whispering the same 4 words. I am deeply sorry. I am deeply sorry. His daughter sat beside him, holding his hand, not understanding. The earthquake had happened 2 weeks ago. 18,000 people dead. Nuclear reactors melting down. Japan's worst disaster since 1945. And her father, 87 years old, kept apologizing for something she could not name. Father, sorry for what? His eyes opened briefly, clouded, distant. Plaza, I signed, I am sorry. Then he died. And his daughter, clearing out his apartment 3 weeks later, found a locked drawer containing economic reports from 1985, letters from colleagues, and a single sheet of paper with those 4 words written in shaking handwriting. I am deeply sorry. She never understood what he was apologizing for, but Hiroshi Yamada did. December 29, 1989, Yokohama. Yamada stood in his small apartment watching his wife pack. She was 36 years old, 8 months pregnant with their second child, and she was leaving him. Because yesterday, while the Nikkei hit 38,915 and everyone at Nomura was celebrating with champagne, Yamada had come home and told her they were selling everything. The stocks, the investment properties, all of it. You are insane. The market will hit 50,000 next year, Everyone says so. We will lose millions. Everyone is wrong. This is a bubble. When it pops, we lose everything. She threw a dress into the suitcase. You have been saying this for 2 years. 2 years. And the market keeps going up. My brother made 300 million yen this year. My sister bought a second house. And you want to sell at the bottom? This is not the bottom. This is the top. She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. You are destroying our family with your paranoia. I cannot live like this, always afraid, always preparing for disaster. I am taking our daughter. I am going to my parents. When you come to your senses, call me. She left that night. Yamada stood alone in the empty apartment and made the phone calls. Sold the stocks, sold the properties. Lost 20% of their paper wealth in transaction fees and market timing. His colleagues at Nomura heard about it. They thought he had gone crazy. Some stopped talking to him. Others made jokes. Yamada selling at the top. Yamada the pessimist. Yamada who does not believe in Japan. 3 months later, the Bank of Japan raised interest rates. The Nikkei began to fall. By August 1990, it had dropped to 20,000. By December 1992, it was 16,000. The bubble had not popped, it had exploded. The colleague who made 300 million yen lost everything and hanged himself in his office. Yamada's brother-in-law, who bought investment properties with borrowed money, declared bankruptcy and disappeared. His wife's sister lost both houses to the bank. Between 1991 and 2003, more than 16,000 Japanese businessmen committed suicide. The newspapers called it karoshi, death from overwork. But economists knew the truth. It was death from hopelessness. Yamada had been right. His family still left him anyway. April 2003. Osaka. Yamada was 52 years old, divorced 12 years, and he had not seen his children in 8 years. His ex-wife had remarried. His daughter was in university. His son was in high school. They did not return his calls. To them, he was the man who destroyed their family with his paranoia, who sold everything at the top and broke their mother's heart. The fact that he had been right, that his caution had saved them from bankruptcy, did not matter. His wife's family had lost everything, and they blamed him for not losing everything too. He lived alone in a small apartment, worked at Nomura, managing portfolios for clients, saved money that never grew because Japan's economy never grew. 0 interest rates, 0 inflation, 0 growth. The lost decade, they called it. Except it was not 1 decade, it was becoming 2, then 3. Every morning he woke up, went to work, came home, ate alone, slept alone. And every night before bed, he thought about December 1989, the night his wife left, the last moment when he could have chosen differently. He could have kept the stocks, ridden the bubble, lost everything with everyone else. At least then he would have his family. But he had been right, and being right had cost him everything that mattered. March 18, 2011. Tokyo. The funeral for Noboru Takeshita was small. A few government officials, some old colleagues, and one man in the back row that nobody recognized. Hiroshi Yamada, 60 years old, stood silently as they lowered the casket. He had never met Takeshita personally, but he knew exactly who the man was and what he had done. After the ceremony, Takeshita's daughter approached him. "Excuse me, did you know my father?" Yamada hesitated. "Not personally, but I worked in currency trading. I was there in 1985 when the Plaza Accord was announced. I watched what it did to our economy. Your father carried a heavy burden." She looked at him with red eyes. He kept apologizing before he died. I found a note. "I am deeply sorry. I never understood what he meant." Yamada felt something break inside his chest. He meant that in September 1985, he signed a document that destroyed Japan's economy for 30 years. He had no choice. America threatened trade war if he refused, but he spent the rest of his life knowing that his signature killed the miracle. That is what he was sorry for. She handed him an envelope. I found this in his desk. Maybe you should have it. Inside was a photograph. 5 men at a table. The Plaza Hotel, 1985. Takeshita's face, younger but already marked with the weight of what he was about to do. On the back, written in English, "Nobody wins economic wars. We all just lose at different speeds." Yamada stood in the cemetery long after everyone left, holding the photograph, and for the first time in 22 years, he cried. Not for his lost family, not for his lonely life, for something larger, for 2 men who had both been right and both lost everything, for a country that worked harder than anyone else and got punished for succeeding, for 40 years of sacrifice that ended because 5 men spent 48 hours in a room and signed a piece of paper. November 2024, Shenzhen, China. Wei Chen was 28 years old, a currency trader at China Merchants Bank, and he was watching something on his Bloomberg terminal that made his blood cold. The yuan was strengthening. Fast. American pressure. Trade negotiations. Demands for currency revaluation. The exact same pattern he had studied in his economics classes. The exact same pattern that destroyed Japan. He called his supervisor. "This is the Plaza Accord. They are doing to us what they did to Japan." His supervisor laughed. "China is not Japan. We are stronger. We will not submit." That is what Japan thought. 3 months later, President Trump announced coordinated currency intervention with G7 allies. The yuan appreciated 8% in 1 week. Chinese export companies' stock prices collapsed. Wei watched the charts and thought about Hiroshi Yamada, whose case study he had read in university. The trader who predicted the crash and lost everything anyway. Wei sold everything that night. His stocks, his Bitcoin, his investment apartment. His girlfriend screamed at him the same way Yamada's wife had screamed 35 years earlier. "You are destroying us with your fear." "Maybe," Wei said quietly, "but I would rather lose you than lose everything." She left. Wei sat alone in his apartment and understood, finally, what the textbooks never taught. Economic wars created the same casualties as military wars. The bullets just moved slower, and being right did not save you. It just meant you understood why you were dying. December 2025, Osaka Cemetery. Hiroshi Yamada was 74 years old. He stood at Noboru Takeshita's grave with an envelope in his hand. Inside was a letter he had written but never sent. "Minister Takeshita," it began, "for 35 years I hated you. I blamed you for signing that document. I thought you destroyed Japan because you were weak. I thought you should have refused, should have fought, should have protected us. I was wrong. You did not destroy Japan, you tried to save it. America gave you a choice between immediate collapse and slow death. You chose slow death because it gave us time. Time to adapt, time to survive. We did not adapt, we did not survive. But that was not your fault. You did what any of us would have done. You chose the least terrible option in a room full of terrible options. I spent my life being right about economics. It cost me my family. It cost me everything that mattered. Now I understand what you understood in 1985. Sometimes being right does not matter. Sometimes there are no good choices, only choices that hurt less. You asked in your final words for forgiveness. I cannot speak for Japan, but I forgive you, because we both tried to save something that was already lost. We both fought wars that could not be won, and we both paid the price for being right when everyone wanted us to be wrong. Rest well, Minister. Your burden is over. Some of us still carry it. He folded the letter, placed it on the grave, and walked away. The sun was setting over Osaka. The city lights were coming on. Japan was still here, still functioning, still wealthy by any measure. But something essential had died in 1985. The belief that hard work mattered, the belief that playing by the rules led to prosperity, the belief that tomorrow would be better than today. That was the real cost of the Plaza Accord. Not the recession, not the unemployment, the death of hope. An entire generation raised knowing that success made you a target. That if you climbed too high, someone would cut you down. Not with bombs, not with invasion. Just with signatures on paper and polite conversations in expensive hotels. Yamada walked home through empty streets. Tomorrow would be like today, and the day after would be like tomorrow. That was the future Japan had bought with 48 hours at the Plaza Hotel. An eternal present with no past worth celebrating and no future worth imagining. In Shenzhen, Wei Chen sat alone in his apartment, watching the yuan collapse, wondering if he had just made the same choice Yamada made in 1989. In Detroit, the grandson of Thomas Fletcher drove past abandoned factories, reading news alerts about Chinese tariffs. In Washington, politicians promised that this time would be different, that punishing China would work better than punishing Japan. Nobody learned. The game never ended. The players just changed. And somewhere, in some future decade, another young trader would sit in another apartment and make the same choice. Lose everything to save something. Be right and lose anyway. That was the lesson of the Plaza Accord. Not that America won or Japan lost, but that economic wars have no winners. Only survivors. And sometimes survival costs more than defeat. Yamada reached his apartment, unlocked the door, and turned on the light. Tomorrow he would wake up and go through the same routine. Eat breakfast alone, ride the train, work at a job that paid enough to survive but not enough to dream. Come home to silence. It was not the ending anyone wanted, but it was the ending everyone had earned.